Shabbat Shalom. So, I had, she wasn't exactly a classmate because she was, I think, a year ahead of me in rabbinical school. Her name was Rabbi Judith Abrams. And sadly, she passed away about 11 years ago at age 56. And she published 23 books, most of them about the Talmud. And, because shortly after, right after I was ordained, I was working for Hillel, and then I joined the conservative movement. So, I didn't really keep up with the Reform rabbis who I had known in school. And one day I came across the fact that she had published all these books about the Talmud, and she lived in Houston, and she actually started an adult education organization to teach people Talmud. And she studied regularly. She had a chavrusa, a study group with the rabbi of the largest Orthodox shul in Houston, and he spoke at her funeral. And she maintained her Reform affiliation, but she had adopted an observant lifestyle, and her husband was a modern Orthodox, I think, a physician. But when I found out about her expertise and her really devoting her career to Talmud, it blew me away because we were in codes class together, okay? And so codes is like the Shulchan Aruch and certain other, if you want to answer a question, a halakha question on the simple level, right, without really delving in and figuring out, well, everybody does it this way, but could you really do it that way? Then you have to really look, at other sources. But, if you want to ask a quick question, so you look in the codes. Okay, and so we were in codes class, and I don't remember what exactly we were studying at, but this voice comes out from the back of the room and shouts, "Why bother? Why bother?" And it was Judy Abrams. Okay, and she said, "We're Reformed. We don't follow any of this stuff. I don't see why we need to know it." Right? And subsequently, she became like a really expert on the Talmud and devoted her whole career to teaching the Talmud. But liberal Jews often cut themselves off from that tradition. Okay, so I was the Hillel director of American University from 1991 to 1995. And we did not have Shabbat morning service. So I could go wherever I wanted. And I started going to, you may have heard of this place called Fabrengen. It's a Havurah. Okay. And I started going there. I went there for a few months, and then I stopped going to Fabrengen, and I started going to Addis Israel. Okay. And so sometime later, I ran into somebody from Fabrengen, and he asked me, "Why don't you come to Fabrengen?" And I said, "Because every Devar Torah in Fabrengen, every Shabbat morning, begins with the same sentence. These are the things in this week's Torah portion which offended me." Okay, and he said, "Well, there's a lot of stuff offensive, right? I mean, I'm sure I didn't look, but I'm sure I could pick out 10 things in this week's Parsha that are offensive to modern sensibility." And he said, well, there's a lot of, and I said, look, it doesn't bother me when people think that stuff in the Torah is offensive. It bothers me that they think that they are the first Jews in history to find that stuff offensive, right? I mean, maybe it offended Rashi, right? Maybe it offended Maimonides, right? Maybe it offended Nachmanides, maybe it offended Sforno, right? So look at the history of the commentaries on that verse and see if it bothered them and and how they explained it, right? But by simply like opening up the text, whether in Hebrew or in an English translation, and simply like sharing your subjective reaction, doesn't, right? I mean, you don't get wisdom from fooling the ignorance of a whole bunch of people. That's not where you get wisdom, right? You get wisdom by tapping in to the tradition, right? And similarly, a couple of years ago, I mean, it's probably still playing on Netflix. There was a British series called The Bible's Buried Secrets. Okay, and it dealt, with all of the things that were inconsistent or contradictory or impossible or undocumented, like in the Bible. Okay, like I'll give you a for instance. Right, for instance, you would think, right, if 600,000 adult men, right, plus women, plus children, plus the elderly, etc., had spent 40 years in the Sinai desert, right, there would be some archaeological evidence of that, okay? There isn't now. I can tell you that that's actually consistent with the Parsha, because in the Parsha, God says, I took care of you for 40 years in the desert and your clothes didn't wear out. Okay, so obviously, right? So the fact that they didn't find any archaeological is actually proof. I mean, I don't buy that, right? But you could say that, right? But so Kelly and I, we watched this series and we found it interesting, but we also yelled at the TV all the time, right? Because it was like, I discovered this problem and nobody ever noticed it before. I'm like, no, yes, it's a problem, but no, you're not the first person to ever notice it before. People have noticed it for hundreds of years, right? And that's why we call it like the chain of tradition, right? And so one of my favorite books of contemporary theology was written by Rabbi Neil Gilman, who taught at JTS for many years. And he wrote a book called Sacred Fragments. Sacred Fragments. And it comes from, that title comes from this week's Parsha. Moses is telling, this, all of Deuteronomy is recounting what happened. And Moses is talking about going up the mountain and coming down and finding that the people made the golden calf and he smashed the tablets. And then he had to go up and get new tablets. And he said, and I deposited the tablets in the ark. All right, and it's ambiguous language, right? I broke the tablets. I came back with new tablets. I deposited the tablets in the ark. Which ones, right? And so the Talmud says both, right? The new tablets and the broken tablets put in the ark, right? Now, why would you have to put the broken tablets in the ark, right? Because they're still holy, and the Talmud compares that actually to a sage or a wise person who, they didn't know the term, but who had senile dementia, right? And so they lost their learning, but there's still holiness in that person, right? And so there may be things in the tradition that don't work for us, right? In fact, I'll give you another example, okay? So there's a discussion group on Facebook called Serious Discussion About Conservative Judaism. Okay, and the moderator of the group, this tough piece that ran recently about Chabad, where like they did a good thing. Okay, they did a good thing. And so the guy says, this is why I love Chabad. Okay, immediately a lot of women start chiming in and said, very nice that you as a man love Chabad, right? I like to lay Torah, right? I want my daughter to learn Torah at her bat mitzvah, okay? I don't love Chabad quite as much as you do, right? Now, would we say that separation of men and women in worship is not part of the Jewish tradition? It is, obviously, right? But it doesn't work for us, right? It doesn't work for us. So we don't follow it, okay? And we actually do believe, at least we conservative rabbis believe, that we have found halakhic precedent that allowed us to dispense with it, right? Obviously, a rabbi wouldn't agree, okay, which is fine, right? That's why we have pluralism, right? But point is, even things that don't work for us anymore, they're still a part of the tradition, right? And we should study them and know them and learn about them and even respect them, even if they don't work for us, okay? And now here's the question, right? What is it, and I'll throw it out really as a question. What is it that makes a group still like a Jewish group? Right? I mean, let me, what I mean. Is Reform Judaism still Judaism? Yeah. Why? Why is Reform Judaism still Judaism? Right? I mean, I'll go back to Judy Abrams before she was a common scholar, right? Why bother? Why bother? We don't follow this stuff. Why do we have to learn it? Right? Why? I mean, by the way, I absolutely agree. Reform Judaism is still Judaism, right? But the question is, why? I'm not moving from this spot until I'm saying.
Because they still believe in the relationship between God and man as set forth originally by Abraham.
Okay, so there's a belief in God, and actually it's interesting, right? Because there's also a group called humanistic Judaism, and actually going back a long time when I was still in rabbinical school, a humanistic congregation applied to join what was then the UAHC, now the URJ, the Union for Reform Judaism. And they said no, because we affirm a belief in God. Right now, belief in God is a very broad category, but the minute you say, no, there's no God, you might still be Judaism, but you're not Reformed. Right, so, yeah, okay, yeah.
Also, I mean, people who don't think they're Jewish, we would say they were Jewish because of inheritance of familial relationship. So it could be that, Rabbi, that's his comment about, what is the word? The brick.
Covenant? Yeah. Okay, yeah, Charlie.
Regardless of ideological differences, we have differences in ideology inside one tribe. And it's not like, someone said, okay, this is no longer part, this is no longer part of the tribe that we have here. This is, no, it's all still part.
All right, it's still part of the tribe, but increasingly, even that's attenuating, right? I mean, because Reformed Judaism accepts patrilineal descent, right? So there are a lot of, but because in other words, like 50 years ago, you would have said yes, or like, at least put it this way, they're a group of Jews, right? Even if what they practice is not still Judaism, right? But today, they're not, that's like a group of Jews. I mean, they accept patrilineal descent, so there are a lot of Reformed Jews who are halachically not Jewish. There are even Reformed rabbis who are halachically not Jewish, right? But, all right, so let me ask another question, because you'll see what I'm getting at. Messianic Jews, right? Still Jews, is the messianic rabbi really a rabbi? Is a messianic synagogue still a shul? Is it a Jewish congregation?
No, and I have relatives who, I have a relative of a distant cousin named Sipra who has converted to this and totally believes in it. And he had his father's funeral. He insisted that his father was had come over to it, but his father never did. If they believe in Jesus, they're not, and I think that's the one thing. I don't know what else, but they believe in Christ and they believe in the whole thing that goes with that.
Okay, so yeah, so Sid Roth was a leader for a long time, the founder, I think, of Jews for Jesus. I know he was your cousin, my condolences. Well, all right, so belief in Jesus, right? So like, so what? I mean, there are, no, and really, so what? Because frankly, there are a lot of adherents of Chabad who think that the Rebbe was the Messiah. Okay, they don't think he rose from the dead, but they think that he will. Okay, that he'll come back or that he never really died. And some of them even believe that he was like God in human form, just like the Christian, right? In other words, there was once a billboard, I think, in a Jewish neighborhood in LA that had a picture, it was put up by your cousin's group, and had a picture of the Rebbe, and it said, right idea, wrong man. Brought to you by Jews for Jesus.
How much did it take you for that number down?
I'm not sure. It was not pretty hot. All right, so, but here's my answer, okay, my answer is no. Okay, they may be a group of Jews, right, because presumably your cousin was halachically Jewish, right? But it is a question of your canon. Okay, right? In other words, right? For a Reformed Jew, right? They have the same canon as we, do, right? Not, the big guns, right? The books that they consider to be holy, right? Even the Talmud, right? You may think the Talmud is not obligatory, but it's still holy. It's part of your canon, right? Messianic Jews have a different canon, right? Because they have the New Testament. Right now, I have nothing against studying the New Testament, right? You heard me say that, if you want to know about Jewish life during the Second Temple, read the Gospel, right? Because 3 out of the 4 authors of the Gospels were Jews, right? Who never thought of themselves as anything but Jews, right? The word Christian hadn't even been invented, right? They were Jews who followed this particular rabbi as opposed to Jews, right? So I'm not, but it's not part of my canon, right? It's not a sacred book for me, right? And it's the canon, I think, that makes you Jewish, right? And so, but, at the same time, talking about the canon, talking about Christians, right? You may have had such a conversation too, right? Like, because a Christian may ask you, like I have on occasion gotten a call saying, from a Christian, we'd like to come and watch the sacrifice. Like, you're 2,000 years too late. Well, but the Bible clearly says you have to make sacrifices. Why don't you? Right? Because there's no, right, but where does it say no temple, no sacrifice? In the Torah, it doesn't say. It doesn't say that. That's Talmudic, that's rabbinic, right? And the point being that, like, even the most Haredi Orthodox Judaism does not look exactly very much like the religion practiced in the Bible. Right? So why is that still Judaism? Right? And the answer to me, so there was a professor at I always forget whether it's Harvard or Yale, one of those places, Yale Law School. His name was Robert Coburn, and he taught about American law, but also about Jewish law. And he had this concept called the chain knowledge. I mean, I've actually discussed this before. What is chain knowledge? So I write chapter 1, right? And then I give it to Brian, and Brian writes chapter 2. And then Brian hands chapter 1 and chapter 2 over to Wendy, and she writes chapter 3, and so on and so on, right? And by the time Sam is done with it, right, the characters don't have a vowel, thank you, have a vowel, right? I was gonna say, don't look a lot like them. Right, they got the same name, but they don't, and even if you watch like a TV show, right, and that's kind of the fun part of binge watching something, now that we have streaming, right? You can watch 3, 4 seasons all at once, and how does it change, right? But here's the thing, right? If you take Sam's chapter and you compare it with Gail's chapter, is there continuity? Yeah, right. Maybe not identical, but there's continuity, right? And then we take Gail's chapter and compare it to Wendy's, et cetera, right? And is there continuity, right? Or is there discontinuity? And I would say that, the New Testament is discontinuity, right? But we have continuity. It's the chain novel, right? So we have, and it's, it's a wild thing to study Talmud and to be following an argument between these two rabbis, right? An argument between these two rabbis, and then, like, because I don't know, you asked me, tell me something about Rabbi Yehoshua. I don't know, right? But there's a guide to Talmud study, right? So you pick it up and you look up these two rabbis who, like, you just finished reading about their argument. And lo and behold, one of them lived in Israel and one of them lived in Babylonia, and they lived 200 years apart. Right? So, like, how are they arguing with each other? Right? Well, it's a reconstructed argument, right? Because they each had students, and the students preserved what they said, and they could had they both been in the same room, this is how the argument would have gone. Right? And then sometimes you get, well, no, the disagreement between these two rabbis is because somebody messed up what they actually said. And this is what they actually said. But the point is, right, it's an ongoing conversation, right? And in the concept of the chain novel, we're part of that conversation too, right? We're part of that conversation too. And that's where study of Talmud comes in. That's where reading Neil Gaiman comes in, right? Or any of, or even taking my class in theology, right? How do you become part of that conversation, right? How do you become your own link in that chain novel? And that's where, you have to connect to everything that went before. So if you just read the Parsha and emote all over it, you're really not part of the conversation. But frankly, if you, read that I'm on vacation, you're giving the Drasha. I'm not saying you all of a sudden you have to go to rabbinical school for 5 years, right? But a lot of resources on the internet, right? And I've seen some of the Drasha that people have given when I'm on vacation. And that's what you do, right? It's not just simply, this is what it says in the Torah, and this is what I think about it in my own point of view. It's like, what does Jonathan Sachs say about it, right? What does your mom's rabbi back in Florida, Rabbi Gold, right? Who's a serious important thinker, right? And by not just like pooling our own, and that's why, I throw these names in, right? Gilman and Cover and Rabbi Abrams and so on and so forth, right? Because we're part of the chain of tradition, right? So that the first set of tablets might be broken, but they're still holy, right? But we're only going to find that holiness if we maintain them and retain them and study them and try and find the wisdom that they contain. And this is what gives us meaning as Jews and as human beings. Shabbat Shalom.